A few years back, I went on a trip that still haunts me to this day. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a chance to unwind and disconnect from the pressures of life. My friend Chris and I decided to rent a cabin deep in the mountains, far from civilization. We weren't looking for anything fancy, just a place where we could relax, drink a few beers, and enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. Chris found the cabin online. It was cheap, and the pictures made it look like the perfect rustic retreat, an old wooden cabin surrounded by thick forest miles from the nearest town. It sounded ideal, the kind of place where we could completely lose ourselves in the wilderness for a few days. The drive up was long and winding, the road getting narrower and more overgrown the farther we went. It felt like we were heading into a different world, one untouched by time. The trees grew taller and denser, blocking out the sunlight and casting long shadows over the road. By the time we finally reached the cabin, the sky was a dull gray, and a light rain had started to fall. The cabin was smaller than it had looked in the pictures, with weathered wooden walls and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. It had an air of neglect about it, like it hadn't seen many visitors in recent years. The windows were dirty, and the front door creaked loudly when we pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was basic but functional. There was a small kitchen with an old stove, a couple of worn armchairs by the fireplace, and two small bedrooms with creaky beds. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying a faint, musty smell, but it was nothing we couldn't handle. We set our bags down, cracked open a couple of beers, and started to settle in. That first night, everything seemed fine. We built a fire, cooked some food, and spent the evening talking and laughing. The rain outside picked up, drumming steadily on the roof, but it only added to the cozy atmosphere inside. By the time we finally went to bed, the fire had died down to glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with the soft sounds of rain and the crackling of the last few burning logs. I slept fitfully, waking up several times during the night. Each time I was struck by how dark and silent the cabin was, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive, like the world outside had disappeared completely. Once or twice, I thought I heard something, a faint scratching sound like nails on wood, but when I strained to listen, there was nothing but the rain. The next day, we decided to explore the area around the cabin. There wasn't much, just thick forest as far as the eye could see. We followed a narrow path that wound through the trees, but it didn't lead anywhere in particular, just more woods, more isolation. After a while, we turned back, feeling a little disappointed, but still in good spirits. We'd come here to relax after all, not to hike. That evening, the weather took a turn for the worse. The rain came down harder, the wind picked up, and the temperature dropped. We decided to stay inside and keep the fire going. The cabin felt more claustrophobic than cozy now, with the wind howling outside and the windows rattling in their frames. It was around midnight when things started to get strange. We were sitting by the fire, half dozing, when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere outside. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was too deliberate, too steady. Chris and I looked at each other, both of us instantly alert. "Probably just a branch," Chris said, trying to sound casual, but we both knew it wasn't. The tapping continued, slow and persistent. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin. We grabbed our flashlights and went to check it out. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making it hard to see anything clearly. We circled the cabin, shining our lights on the walls and the ground, but there was nothing there. No branches, no signs of anyone or anything that could be making the noise. As soon as we got back inside, the tapping stopped. The cabin was silent again, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavy, thick with a sense of unease that neither of us could shake. We tried to go back to our conversation, but the mood was ruined. Every little noise, the creak of the floorboards, the whistle of the wind, set us on edge. We eventually turned in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up, sure that I heard something moving outside the cabin, but every time I got up to check, there was nothing there, just the darkness pressing in on the windows. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was that same rhythmic tapping, but this time it was coming from inside the cabin. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, echoing through the small, dark space. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw that Chris was awake too, staring wide-eyed into the darkness. The tapping was coming from somewhere near the back of the cabin, maybe even from under the floorboards. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity, just listening to that steady, unnatural sound. Finally, Chris whispered, "We need to check the basement." I hadn't even realized the cabin had a basement, but there it was. A small, almost hidden door in the corner of the kitchen, covered by a threadbare rug. The door was old and warped, with rusted hinges and a heavy padlock that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But now the tapping was louder, more insistent, coming from right beneath our feet. We hesitated, but what else could we do? We had to know what was down there, what was making that sound. Chris found a hammer in one of the drawers and used it to break the old padlock. The door creaked open with a loud, unsettling groan, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into complete darkness. The smell hit us first, a foul, earthy odor that made me gag. It was like the air down there had been trapped for decades, slowly rotting. Chris grabbed a flashlight and started down the stairs, and I followed, my heart racing. The basement was small, just a dirt floor and stone walls, with the remains of old tools and rusted equipment piled in the corners. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. In the middle of the floor, half buried in the dirt, was a wooden hatch, just big enough for a person to fit through. The tapping was coming from beneath it. We stared at the hatch, the flashlight beam flickering as Chris's hand shook. The tapping had stopped now, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible scratching. It was like whatever was down there knew we were close, knew we were listening. Chris reached down slowly and pried the hatch open. The smell that rose from the dark hole beneath it was overpowering, like a mix of decaying meat and something even worse. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and as we shone the flashlight down into the hole, we saw it. Just a glimpse, but it was enough. Something was down there, something that didn't belong. A figure hunched and twisted, its skin pale and mottled, eyes wide and unblinking. It moved quickly, scuttling deeper into the tunnel like a spider retreating into its web. The sound it made as it moved was like nails on a chalkboard, a horrible scraping noise that sent shivers down my spine. We slammed the hatch shut and ran up the stairs, our panic rising with every step. We barricaded the basement door with whatever we could find, furniture, firewood, anything heavy enough to keep that thing down there. The scratching and tapping continued, growing louder, more desperate, as if it was trying to claw its way out. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, huddled by the fireplace, listening to that horrible noise and waiting for dawn. The rain outside turned into a storm, the wind howling like a banshee, but even that couldn't drown out the sound coming from below. It felt like the night would never end, like we were trapped in some kind of nightmare that we couldn't wake up from. But eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the windows, and the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, thick with the tension of what we had just experienced. We didn't say a word as we grabbed our bags and left the cabin, leaving everything else behind. We just wanted to get out of there, as far away from that place as possible. We never spoke about what we saw. I don't even know if Chris remembers it the same way I do. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. There was something in that cabin, something that had been there for a long time, waiting in the dark. If you ever find yourself in an old, isolated cabin, and you hear something that doesn't seem right, don't go looking for it. Some things are better left alone, buried where they belong, in the dark, forgotten corners of the world. Because once you've opened that door, there's no closing it again.